Hey folks, hope everybody's doing well. Today we're going to be talking about human rights quite clearly, but also more generally about the concept of rights and the way in which rights are embedded within the three processes or three drivers of globalization we've been studying: economic processes, state-led processes, and cultural processes, and especially those, the second and the third of those. Human rights obviously are global in scope. They are, by definition, expanded to the entire world, but also marked by uneven enforcement, but even more fundamentally, the shifting focus of rights in general, from the state to the level of culture, has been one of the defining features of the rights regime under conditions of globalization. So the way I'm going to do this today is give you a bit of an overview of the argument I'm trying to make. It's a little bit abstract, and so I have a few sketches to help us through the material. Then I'm going to talk about T.H. Marshall's triptych of rights: social rights, political rights, civil rights, and the way in which these are defined very clearly vis-a-vis to state authority. And then third, we're going to move into the way in which some of these older divisions and some of these older categories of rights have really changed in recent years as we've seen the NGO movement, as we've seen new social movements, and the campaign to end FGC, which is a prominent feature of several of the readings that you have in this unit of the course. So, to get us started, I'd like to ask a general question to my students, whether in class or online. Are human rights globalization's greatest success or its greatest failure? And of course, the ambiguity comes from the fact that you could quite viably make the argument either way. Obviously, I don't expect you to answer this right now, but it is a question I'd like you to keep in mind as we're working through this material. You can look at the various campaigns described in your course materials in this unit and look at, and basically say, wow, this is a story of great success upon success upon success, granted with some setbacks and with very clear problems, but all the same, that this is an ever-escalating tale of progress and development of human rights as a feature of life on Earth, basically. Or you can look at this and say, this has been a story of tragedy. And I think there are ample reasons to think about them in one way and in the other, but it's just a question I like to keep in mind as we're working through this material. The background that I want to sort of work through here is that there are, in a sense, two parallel traditions to rights in general over, let's say, certainly the last 200 years, in some cases going back further than that. So on the one hand, we have what I'm going to call the rights within states movement, a set of movements to provide civil, political, and social, and sometimes cultural rights, usually by petitioning national governments, launching protests, passing legislation. Workers' right movement, voting rights, and so on and so forth fit very squarely into that rectangle in this diagrammatic way of looking at rights. We have that tradition. It is a tradition in which people typically represent themselves as workers, or as citizens, or as voters, or as having a role to play in a national society, and demand of their governments then a series of rights reflective of their role, or reflective of what they want their role to be. Number two, we have a human rights tradition, in other words, thinking about rights at a purely global level. This dates at least back to the Peace of Westphalia, so 1648, recognizing certain religious rights and certain tolerance for religious rights, but then picks up steam, of course, at the end of the 19th and into the 20th century after World War I, and you have some readings and some materials that cover that and give you a little bit of the background and history. I won't go into too much detail here. And what we've seen in the last 20 to 30 years or so, in other words, as this current wave of globalization has really picked up steam, is this convergence of the two into a concept of what I'm going to call human rights as a global culture. The relationship between these two spheres, so that as human rights become cultural norms embedded within broader ethical and also political and cultural claims about globalization. In other words, human rights aren't just cultural or culturally defined, although that too is an area of contention. They are, in a sense, culture. They are a key ongoing feature of the cultural life of the planet at a global scale. And this is an argument that some of the material is going to be kind of leading us up to thinking about and to talking about. So moving on from here, moving on from this. Let's start off with T.H. Marshall and the Triptych of Right. T.H. Marshall was a British sociologist, dividing right into three categories. First, civil rights. These date from the 18th century. Freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom from cruel and unusual punishment, the right to due process, and so on and so forth. They date to some of the classic 17th and 18th century foundational legal texts of contemporary law and constitutional law and of the rights regime. The English Bill of Rights, the French Declaration of the Right of Man and Citizen, as I believe it's properly called, and a whole series of others. These are usually developed by a process of compromise between states and citizens. Basically, citizens win limits on state action. The state shall not imprison arbitrarily. The state shall not throw people in prison without due process by conceding power and authority to the state. And this is something that Bolyai, in one of the readings I gave you guys in this unit, really sort of traces out. Civil rights are obviously very important and valuable. I'm not trying to suggest otherwise. But they are, in a sense, bought at a cost. And that cost is the increasing solidity and the increasing role of states in everyday life. Number two, political rights. Classically, the right to vote, the right to hold office, the right to run for office, and so forth. Usually, this is again a process of shifting loyalties from family, from religious institution to the state by granting people an extended menu of political rights. Women in the 20th century progressively gain access to the franchise. In the US, we have this long struggle over the right to vote for African Americans, especially in the US South. And then third, social rights, where the existence of these rights is entirely predicated on the assumption of a state that can basically guarantee them. Social rights are rights to welfare, economic protections, protections against poverty in old age when you can't work anymore, and so forth. But they exist entirely in relation to a government that can basically draw taxes and draw revenue from working citizens in order to pay for them. They are the classic alienable rights. Why is this significant? Well, part of what's going on here is a sort of large-scale set of differences between positive and negative rights. Rights to something in the case of positive rights, and rights from something in negative rights. Between those rights that restrict the states and those that incorporate people to the state, and so on and so forth. And Bolyai is a really good source for this, because even though the text was published back in 1987, it's not exactly very recent, at the same time, it is a way of thinking about the costs and the compromises, the balance of different forces going into the building of civil, political, and social rights. And his big argument, to make a long story short, is that, well, rights become more fully expressed in national constitutions as state authority expands to incorporate citizens more thoroughly into state programs. In other words, the big 20th century expansion of rights has been in the area of alienable rights. I conveniently circled over there to kind of highlight this big expansion in the index he creates in inalienable rights. Largely in decolonizing countries in the 1950s and 60s as we get into the 1950-1970 columns on that chart. But also a clear positive correlation between rights and duties. In other words, as people gain more and more rights and more guarantees, they also gain more and more duties towards state authority. Now, again, this was written in 1987. Things have changed in some ways. Some have changed over the years in lots of different kinds of ways. Partly, some of those alienable rights, like social rights, have been drawn down, and David Harvey, in his piece on neoliberalism, was basically introducing you to some of those arguments. Basically, in the 1990s and 2000s, as governments see the need to be business ready and to be business friendly, they start to draw down some social protections precisely in order to accomplish those goals and those objectives. We also saw this in some of the broader materials that we looked at in the unit on the global economy. But this is Bolyai's argument for what it is, and it really articulates quite nicely this relationship between the nature of the state and the nature of citizens' rights as it had historically developed up until that point in time. At the same time, we have this parallel tradition of thinking about rights not in relation per se to national governments, the way Bolyai is describing them, but in relation to a broader set of legal instruments operating at a global level. You have some readings on this, talking about the League of Nations and women's rights, talking about the CEDAW, the Convention for the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, and a whole series of other legal instruments that go on from there. The cornerstone of all of these is the UDHR, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It's a declaration and not a treaty or a convention, which means that it is technically quote-unquote soft law. In other words, it is not binding. However, it has helped generate the impetus and the momentum for a whole series of other legal tools that are binding. Human rights law as a whole is a complicated field. We're not going to get into a ton of detail on that right now. But to make a long story short, we have a system of national implementation of human rights norms with modest international oversight. In other words, while the laws are universal in scope and in intent, the enforcement is usually national or regional, and there are a bunch of different examples of this and how this works. So in Europe, you have the ECHR, the European Court of Human Rights, probably one of the strongest pieces of the human rights enforcement puzzle, but very much focused on a single group of countries and not having jurisdiction over the world as a whole. Well, for a long time, these two parallel trends in rights thinking, rights vis-a-vis to the state, defining citizenship, state obligations, and so forth, which is what Bolyai is talking about, and, on the other hand, this body of international law, are more or less two separate bodies or two separate entities. And then in the last 20 to 30 years or so, we start to see a shift and we start to see a change where some of these boundaries are being broken down. And rights are going to be increasingly part of what I'm going to call world culture or geoculture. In other words, a kind of stacked system where instead of having the state at the center of the picture, we have the state, organizations and associations, and identities and citizenship and questions of citizenship and belonging being very much part of the broader picture. Well, what does this mean in practical terms? I know this gets a bit abstract after a while. Well, think of some human rights campaigns that have gotten a certain amount of prominence in relatively recent years. And I'm thinking about the ones I've learned about over the years. Of course, you might think of other ones. For example, the suppression of LGBTQ rights in Russia, which came to a lot of public attention in the run-up to the 2014 Winter Olympic Games in Sochi. Or if we think of criminal justice reform and rights vis-a-vis to the U.S. prison system, and of course it's not the other prison systems in the world are blameless when it comes to human rights violations, to say the least, but in the U.S. we do incarcerate a very large number of people proportionally and relative to other developed countries. And of course, the conditions of prisoners, especially the practice of using solitary confinement, has come under fairly extensive scrutiny from Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and a whole series of other groups. Or think of the case study we have in this unit, ending FGM or FGC, female genital mutilation, female genital cutting, and the Guardian's campaign to bring this practice to an end, but also a whole series of campaigns to try to call attention to this, where this isn't really in the one camp or the other. It's redefining the terrain of rights as through a lens of cultural legitimacy, where increasingly it's seen as illegitimate to persecute people based on their sexual orientation. But at the same time, that's really communicated and that's really developed as a set of cultural norms and cultural practices at a global level. Even those who disagree still speak the same language of human rights and still talk about these issues in terms of international human rights. And so what we see emerging is this kind of global culture of rights that really isn't simply inside the nation state, it really isn't simply in international law, but it's mediated through organizations and associations, right in the middle of the slide over there. NGOs, INGOs, really mobilizing attention to focus attention on rights, but in ways that don't simply fit into these boxes of civil, political, and social rights of previous years, but then also don't simply sit at the international level on what the United Nations does, for example. Well, the material we have in this unit of the class is really sort of trying to help us see a perspective of rights based on, or rights as, global culture. The readings that we have in this section of the class, of course, focus largely on the international women's movement as a really interesting case study and point of the way in which rights become culture, and in which a whole series of assumptions about legitimate ways for human beings to relate to their state, to their government, really start to manifest themselves and become evident. I have a quotation here from one of the articles basically talking about the relationship between women, Islam, and particular patriarchal governments in Barlow's analysis of feminism in Iran, which I think is really interesting and really on point in this regard. And the materials as a whole are sort of designed to help us trace this evolution and this movement to a view of rights as a kind of global culture or geoculture based in a certain form of rationality that people disagree with, but at the same time that many people, even if they disagree with, still recognize and still see out there in the world. Thank you.